"You don't belong here." The slap cracked across the mess hall like a gunshot. 200 forks froze in midair. 200 soldiers stopped breathing at once. She didn't cry out, didn't stumble, just wiped the blood from her lip, looked her attacker dead in the eye, and said 4 words that would end his entire career. "That won't be necessary, sir." Then she walked out. What Captain Holt Bregman didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he'd just struck in front of 200 witnesses wasn't some nobody wandering onto his base. 10 minutes later, 3 generals walked through that door, and by the time the sun set on Fort Renner, a captain's career was over. A colonel's secrets were unraveling, and a woman nobody could name was about to bring down an entire chain of command built on 15 years of silence. This is her story. Stay until the end, you won't believe how far it goes. Fort Renner sat on the flat scrub of West Texas like something forgotten by God and remembered by nobody. Heat shimmered off the tarmac even in October. Dust settled on everything: boots, windowsills, the inside of your teeth if you talked too long outside. The mess hall was loud that morning. 200 soldiers, maybe more, forks scraping trays, voices bouncing off cinder block, steam rising off scrambled eggs, somebody's radio playing low from the kitchen line. Ordinary, forgettable, the kind of morning nobody remembers until something breaks it open. Then the sound, flesh on flesh, sharp, final. The mess hall didn't go quiet the way rooms go quiet when someone drops a tray. It went quiet the way rooms go quiet right before a building comes down. 200 people froze mid-motion. A fork stopped an inch from someone's mouth. A coffee cup hovered untouched, going cold in somebody's hand. Captain Holt Bregman stood in the center of it all, chest heaving, palms still raised like he was deciding whether to do it again. Fallon Bracewell didn't move, didn't stumble, didn't gasp, didn't do any of the things a person is supposed to do when they've just been struck across the face in front of 200 witnesses. She just stood there, steady, her jaw already reddening, a thin line of blood at the corner of her lip where her teeth had caught the inside of her cheek, and her eyes calm, unbearably calm, like she'd already read the ending of this particular story and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "You don't belong here," Bregman said, voice cracking with something between fury and fear. Spit flew when he talked. It always did, when men like him lost the thread. "You people walk around here like you own the place. No rank, no respect. You don't even wear the uniform right." Fallon touched 2 fingers to her lip, looked at the blood, wiped it slow, deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. "That won't be necessary, sir," she said. 4 words, that was all. Then she turned, walked out. Boots on linoleum, steady as a metronome, steady as a heartbeat that refuses to spike no matter what you throw at it. Behind her, the mess hall exploded into noise. Because that's what silence does when it finally breaks. It doesn't trickle out, it floods. Did he just? She didn't even flinch. Who is she? I've never seen her before. Bregman stood in the wreckage of his own outburst, breathing hard, trying to look like a man who'd just restored order, instead of one who just detonated his career and didn't know it yet. His hand was shaking, small, almost invisible. Except Sergeant Major Wade Pruitt saw it from 3 tables back, and 26 years in this uniform had taught him exactly what a shaking hand after a moment like that actually meant. Fear, not anger. Fear, dressed up as anger, because fear alone was too honest a thing for a man like Bregman to wear in public. Pruitt had seen officers like Bregman before, men who confused volume with authority, who mistook silence for weakness because they'd never once been in a room with someone who chose it on purpose. And he'd seen people like the woman who just walked out. The ones who stay calm when the moment calls for panic, who don't need to raise their voice because they already know how this ends. Those people were never, ever what they appeared to be. Pruitt stood, tray still in hand, and followed her path toward the door. Behind him, Bregman was already spinning the story loud enough for the whole room to hear. Some people think they can walk onto a military installation and do whatever they please. No accountability, no structure. He straightened his collar like it might straighten his dignity along with it. "I don't care who she thinks she is. This is my post. A few of the younger soldiers nodded along, eager, wide-eyed, hungry for a version of events where the captain was still the hero. They didn't know better yet. But the older ones, the ones who'd been in long enough to recognize a lie mid-flight, kept their eyes down, finished their food in silence, left as fast as they could without looking like they were running. Pruitt noticed one soldier slip out the side door without a word. Specialist Reeve Nolan. A kid Bregman had humiliated 3 weeks earlier over a boot polish infraction, so small it barely registered as an infraction at all. Made him do push-ups in the gravel until his knuckles bled. Nolan hadn't been the same since. Outside, the October wind cut sharp and dry across the flat brown nothing of Fort Renner. The kind of place careers came to die quietly, far from anyone in Washington who might notice. Pruitt found her near the perimeter fence, hands in her jacket pockets, watching a cargo plane taxi down the runway, like it was the most interesting thing in the state of Texas. She wore no insignia, no name tape, just standard issue fatigues that looked like they'd come off a shelf that morning, and boots that were scuffed in a way that suggested actual use, not costume. Hair pulled back tight, a few strands loose at her temple. Late 20s, maybe. Hard to tell exactly. People who'd lived certain kinds of lives carried their years differently. Wore the wear on the inside instead of the outside. "You okay?" Pruitt asked, stopping a respectful distance away. She didn't turn. "I'm fine." That was a hell of a thing back there. It was predictable. Pruitt studied her profile, sharp jaw, expression flat as still water, eyes tracking the aircraft's climb with the kind of focus that came from years of being trained to notice everything and reveal nothing. "You going to report him?" "I don't need to. He hit you in front of 200 people. That's assault. That's career-ending. Possibly criminal." She turned then, just slightly, and for 1/2 second something flickered behind her eyes. Not anger, not fear, something colder, something patient. "I know," she said. "It's already in motion, Sergeant Major." Pruitt blinked, because he hadn't told her his rank, hadn't said a single word about who he was, and she hadn't looked at his collar, once hadn't looked at anything except the runway the entire time they'd been standing there. "Who are you?" he asked, quieter now. The corner of her mouth moved. Barely. Not quite a smile. "Someone who doesn't need to explain herself to Captain Bregman." Then she walked away, gravel crunching under her boots, calm as a Sunday morning, like nothing on this earth could rattle her. Pruitt stood there a long moment, heart pounding for reasons he couldn't name and didn't like. 26 years, and he still knew a storm brewing when he saw one. That specific stillness in the air right before lightning finds ground. And that woman, she wasn't running from the storm. She was it. By early afternoon, rumors were moving through Fort Renner like wildfire through dry grass. Soldiers clustered in motor pools, outside barracks, in supply closets, anywhere two people could talk without an officer overhearing. The base had been dying of boredom for months. Routine drills, routine inspections, the same gray sameness every single day. And suddenly there was this, real drama. Career-ending, gut-punch, water-cooler drama. And every single person on post had a theory. "She's Inspector General. Has to be. Undercover audit. No, she's federal. Some kind of federal investigator. My cousin in supply said she's been asking about inventory discrepancy since Tuesday. Real specific questions. Somebody said she flew in on a plane with no tail markings. Private First Class Delray Ash working the fuel depot had his own theory. Maybe she's nobody. Maybe Bregman just slapped some contractor and now everybody's losing their mind over nothing." His supervisor, a staff sergeant with a face like sun-cracked leather, shook his head slow. "Random contractors don't stand there like that after getting hit. They cry. They scream. They call a lawyer on the spot." That woman looked like she was checking something off a list. What kind of list? The kind that ends with people in handcuffs. Ash went quiet, because 3 weeks earlier he'd watched Bregman lose it on a maintenance crew over a delayed vehicle, screaming about incompetence, threatening to have every single one of them reassigned to the worst posting he could find. The crew chief had filed a formal complaint through proper channels. It had gone exactly nowhere. 2 days later, that same crew chief was pulling latrine duty and midnight gate guard in freezing weather. Message received. Keep your mouth shut or pay for it. Except maybe, just maybe, things were about to be different. In the administration building, Private Marlene Coit sat at her desk pulling personnel files for the weekly command briefing. Routine work. She'd done it 100 times, except when she typed in the name from the incident report. Fallon Bracewell. The system didn't just deny access. It locked her out completely. Red text flashed across the screen. Restricted. Clearance insufficient. Access attempt logged. Coit's stomach dropped straight through the floor. 2 years in personnel. She'd pulled files on colonels, on visiting brigadier generals, even on a senator's aide who'd toured the post the previous spring. Nobody had ever been locked this hard. Not once. Worse, the system had logged the attempt, which meant somewhere, someone now knew she'd looked. She picked up the phone with fingers that had gone unsteady, dialed the base IT desk. "Hi, I'm trying to pull a personnel file and I'm getting a clearance error I've never seen. Can you help me with a name?" Name. Bracewell. Fallon Bracewell. Silence. The kind that stretches so long you start to wonder if the call dropped. Then, careful, like the man on the other end was choosing every word with tweezers. "Where are you calling from?" "Admin. Building 4. 2nd floor. Stay there, don't touch anything else." The line went dead. Coit set the receiver down, hands trembling now, a cold sweat breaking along the back of her neck. She'd grown up on army posts. Father, uncle, both career soldiers. She knew this culture in her bones. And she knew exactly what it meant when the system told you to stay put and wait. It meant you'd brushed against something people with real authority cared about protecting. 5 minutes later, 2 men walked through the door. Not base security. Different uniforms. Federal credentials clipped to their belts. Coiled earpieces. They moved with a kind of controlled efficiency that made every typist in the office stop typing at once. Private Coit. She stood so fast her chair skidded. "Yes, sir. Come with us. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just pulling a routine file. I swear, we know. We just need a few minutes." They walked her down 2 flights of stairs, through a corridor she'd never noticed before, into a windowless room with a table, 3 chairs, and a recorder sitting in the middle, like an accusation waiting to happen. "Tell us everything you know about the woman you tried to look up." "I don't know anything. I've never met her." Captain Bregman put in the request this morning for the briefing packet. The 2 agents traded a glance. One wrote something down. What exactly did the request say? Just her name. Said she'd been on post a couple days. Standard procedure. "And you've never seen a clearance block like that before?" "Never." "Did Captain Bregman say anything else about her? Describe her? Say why she was here?" Coit thought back, straining. "No, just that he needed her in the packet." He seemed annoyed, but he's always annoyed about something. More notes. Another glance. "Okay, you're going to go back to your desk and continue your day. Don't mention this conversation. Don't attempt access again. Don't discuss the name Bracewell with anyone." "Understood?" "Yes, sir. If anyone asks where you were, you had a family call." They let her go. She climbed the stairs on legs that didn't quite belong to her, sank into her chair, and pretended to work, while her heart slammed against her ribs like it was trying to get out. Because something enormous was moving under the surface of this base, and she'd just barely touched the edge of it. Captain Holt Bregman sat in his office on the 3rd floor of headquarters, feet up on the desk, tie loosened, typing his incident report with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he'd already won. He was still riding the high off the confrontation, still convinced he'd done the right thing, already picturing the commendation he might receive for maintaining good order under difficult circumstances. He typed fast, painted himself the hero of his own story. At approximately 715 hours, I encountered an unidentified female individual in the enlisted mess who failed to render appropriate courtesy. Subject refused to identify herself or explain her presence on the installation. Subject's demeanor was disruptive to good order. Physical correction was necessary to maintain command authority. He hit save, leaned back, grinned at the ceiling tiles, Let them try to spin this. He had 200 witnesses. He had a time-stamped official record. He had the full authority of his rank behind him. That woman, whoever she thought she was, had walked into his house and disrespected him in front of his own soldiers. She'd made her choice. Now she'd live with the consequences. Except his phone buzzed. Base commander's office. The caller ID read. He picked up. Captain Bregman. Report to Colonel Ashcomb's office immediately. The voice belonged to a nervous first lieutenant who always sounded 3 seconds from a panic attack. Bregman frowned. What's this about? Just get over here, sir. The line went dead. He hung up, irritation prickling at the back of his neck, probably bureaucratic noise. The colonel was always paranoid about optics, always worried how things looked further up the chain. But Bregman had been careful. He documented everything, followed procedure to the letter. This would blow over by tomorrow, and by next week it would be a story soldiers told each other over beers. He straightened his uniform in the mirror by the door and headed out. The walk across the quad felt longer than it should have. The afternoon sun sat harsh and white overhead, no clouds to soften it. Soldiers went quiet when he passed. A few saluted, but their faces gave away nothing. None of the usual nod, the usual small talk. Bregman ignored it. Probably just rattled from the morning's drama. They'd forget by Friday. Except when he stepped into headquarters, the air itself seemed to change temperature. Federal agents lined the hallway. Not base security in their relaxed, familiar postures. These were different. Dark suits despite the heat. Sunglasses indoors. Earpieces coiled like small black snakes. Hands resting easy near sidearms in a way that wasn't casual at all. Bregman slowed. Confusion crawled up his spine like cold water. What's going on? He asked one of them. The agent didn't even look at him. Keep moving, Captain. His mouth went dry. Because federal agents didn't show up for routine discipline complaints. They didn't show up unless something enormous was happening. Something criminal. He reached the colonel's office. The door stood open. Inside, Colonel Grant Ashcombe sat behind his desk, face pale as paper, jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out along his cheek like a cable under tension. He looked like a man who'd just been told his own diagnosis was terminal. And across from him 3 men in dress uniforms, shoulders heavy with stars that caught the fluorescent light and gleamed like a warning shot. 3 generals. Bregman's stomach lurched hard enough to taste bile. Captain Bregman, Ashcombe said, voice stripped of every ounce of the authority it usually carried. Come in. Close the door. Bregman obeyed, legs moving on training alone while his mind screamed static. He came to attention. Eyes forward, hands at his sides, heart hammering so hard he could feel it behind his teeth. The general in the center stepped forward. Tall, silver-haired. 3 stars on each shoulder. A face carved out of 30 years of decisions that sent people into danger and sometimes never brought them home. His voice, when it came, was cold enough to freeze standing water. Captain Bregman, do you know who you struck in that mess hall this morning? Bregman's mouth worked. No sound came out. Then, stumbling, Sir, she didn't identify herself. She wasn't in proper uniform. She refused to answer the question, Captain. No, sir. I don't know who she is. The general's expression didn't move, not a flicker. Her name is Major Fallon Bracewell. She has been operating undercover on this installation for the past 6 days, under direct authorization from this command, conducting a federally sanctioned inspection into misconduct and command failures at Fort Renner. The floor tilted. Bregman opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came. You assaulted a commissioned field-grade officer in front of 200 witnesses, the general continued, each word a hammer coming down slow and deliberate. That is a serious federal offense. It is also a serious crime under civilian law. You are under investigation as of this moment. You will surrender your sidearm, your credentials, and your access to this installation immediately. Bregman's brain snagged on one word and would not release it. Major. Major. She's a major. Do you understand what I am telling you, Captain? Yes, sir. Good. Military police will escort you to confinement pending formal charges. You are not to speak to anyone outside this installation. Your chain of command has been notified. 2 agents stepped up at his elbows like shadows given weight. One held out an open palm. Bregman unholstered his sidearm with numb fingers, then his access badge, then his ID card, then his phone. Everything that had ever proved he was somebody, stripped away in under 30 seconds. They walked him out through the same hallway, past soldiers whose mouths hung open, past Sergeant Major Pruitt, standing in the corner with his arms crossed and his face carved from stone, past Private Coit watching from the admin doorway, with an expression that might have been pity, or might have been relief that it wasn't her. Bregman walked like a man already dead, because in every way that mattered, professionally, socially he was. They put him in a holding cell in the basement of the provost's office. Gray cinder block walls, a steel cot bolted to the floor, a toilet with no seat, tucked in the corner like an afterthought. The door closed with a sound like the ending of everything he thought he'd built. He sat down on the cot, stared at his own hands. He'd struck a field-grade officer, a woman conducting a federally sanctioned investigation, and she'd let him do it. Stood there, calm as still water, and let him destroy himself with his own hand. By evening, Fort Renner sat under something close to lockdown. Gates sealed, no movement in or out without written authorization signed above the rank of colonel. A pair of unmarked helicopters circled once, twice, before setting down near the airfield, sleek and dark, the kind that belonged to nobody in particular, and everybody with real authority all at once. Dark government sedans rolled through the front gate, men and women in plain suits moving like they already owned the ground beneath their feet. Federal investigators occupied an entire building by nightfall, converting it into a command post. Whiteboards, timelines stretching wall to wall, evidence crates stacked to the ceiling. It wasn't only about Bregman anymore. This had become something much bigger, something that had been growing under the surface of Fort Renner for a long time before Fallon Bracewell ever set foot on it. Specialist Reeve Nolan found himself sitting across a table from 2 investigators. One, an older woman with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. The other, younger, typing, without ever looking down at his keyboard. "Tell us about your interactions with Captain Bregman," the woman said. Nolan shifted. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble. You're not getting anyone in trouble. We're establishing a pattern." He took a breath. 3 weeks ago, my boots weren't shined right. Small thing. He saw me in the motor pool and lost it completely. Screamed at me in front of my whole platoon. Made me do push-ups in the gravel until my hands were bleeding. Called me a disgrace to the uniform. "Did you file a complaint?" I thought about it. "But you didn't." "No, ma'am." "Why not?" Nolan looked down at his own hands, the same ones that had bled into gravel 3 weeks earlier. "Because the last guy who filed against Captain Bregman got put on every terrible duty roster for 2 straight months. Midnight gate guard. Latrine cleaning. Message was pretty clear. Keep your mouth shut." "Who was that?" "Sergeant Colt Farrow. Transferred off post last month. Got out of here as fast as he could." More notes. The younger investigator pulled something up on his laptop. "We'll need to reach Sergeant Farrow. Any idea where he transferred?" "Fort Kessler, I think. Louisiana." "Thank you, Specialist. If we have follow-up questions, we'll be in touch." Nolan stood to leave, hesitated at the door. "Is it true?" he asked, quiet now. "What they're saying? That the woman he hit was a major?" The older investigator looked at him over her glasses. "That's correct." "Damn," Nolan said softly, mostly to himself. He finally did it to the wrong person. He left. The door clicked shut behind him. The 2 investigators exchanged a look. "How many interviews so far?" the woman asked. 14, and every single one has a story. Not all about Bregman specifically, about the culture here, the climate, the way things get buried." "Ashcombe knew," the woman said. "He had to have known. He did more than know." The younger investigator turned his laptop around. Personnel files, disciplinary reports, emails. 6 formal complaints filed against Bregman over the last 18 months. Every single one reviewed and dismissed by Colonel Ashcombe personally. Some of them had witnesses. documentation, everything you'd need to bring charges. The woman leaned back, rubbing her temples like she could physically massage away what she was seeing. So we're not just prosecuting one captain. Looks that way. We're prosecuting the whole command structure. While Fort Renner tore itself open under the weight of its own secrets, Fallon Bracewell sat alone in a small guest quarters near the far end of the airfield, the kind of room the Army reserved for people it didn't quite know how to categorize. She'd taken off the fatigues, sat now in plain civilian clothes, a bag of ice pressed to her jaw, the swelling already blooming purple along her cheekbone. Her phone buzzed against the desk. She looked at the screen. 2 words in the caller display. Dad's cell. Her stomach tightened before she even answered. Because that was the thing about her father. Even from 400 miles away, even through a phone line, Earl Bracewell had a way of making her feel 18 years old again, standing in his kitchen, trying to explain a decision he'd already decided to disapprove of. She let it ring twice more before she picked up. Dad, I heard something happened. Of course he had. News like that moved faster than official channels ever could. I'm fine. Fine isn't an answer, Fallon. It's the only one I've got right now. A pause on the line, long enough that she could hear him breathing, could picture him exactly standing in his garage back in Amarillo, surrounded by tools he didn't need anymore. A coffee mug from his old unit, sitting untouched on the workbench because he never actually drank the coffee, just liked having something from before within reach. You could have told me you were going undercover again. You know I can't do that. I know you won't. Because there it was. The old wound, reopening the way it always did, fast and clean, like it had never actually closed in the first place. Dad, you left the field to go sit behind a desk. That's what you told me. Intelligence, work, safer. And now I'm hearing my daughter got struck in the face by some captain who didn't know who he was dealing with. It's part of the job. It shouldn't be. Fallon closed her eyes, pressed the ice a little harder against her jaw, like the cold might do something about the ache that had nothing to do with her face at all. You went to war at 23, she said quiet. You don't get to tell me what kind of risk is acceptable. Silence again. Longer this time. That's different, he said finally. Is it? I never asked you to keep careful for my sake, Fallon. I asked you to be careful for yours. Something in his voice cracked just slightly right at the edge, the way ice does before it finally gives. She didn't have an answer for that. Not one that wouldn't split them both open further than they already were. I have to go, Dad. Fallon, I'll call you when this is done. She hung up before he could say anything else, sat there in the quiet, ice melting against her skin, and let herself feel it for exactly 10 seconds. The old ache. The distance that had grown between them ever since she'd traded a rifle for a badge nobody was allowed to see. Then she set the ice down, stood, and put the mask back on, because there wasn't room for 10 seconds to become 11. Not tonight. She thought about the day she'd told him she was leaving her sniper platoon for intelligence work. How he hadn't understood. How could he? When for him, service had always meant a rifle in your hands and a mission you could point to. He'd looked at her across that same garage workbench and asked if she was running from something. She'd told him no. She was running towards something. He hadn't believed her then. Maybe he still didn't. But she'd learned over 6 years of quiet rooms and quieter missions that the fights worth winning rarely looked like fights at all. They looked like patience, like silence, like standing still while someone else swung first, because letting them swing was the only way to make sure the whole rotten structure behind them came down too. She thought of Bregman's hand connecting with her jaw, the way he hadn't hesitated, hadn't questioned for even half a second whether striking an unidentified woman on a military post might carry consequences. That kind of certainty didn't come from nowhere. Men like Bregman were built by systems that had told them, again and again, that consequences were for other people, which meant Bregman was never the real problem. He was just the symptom finally visible enough for someone to notice. There was a knock at her door a little after 9 that evening. She opened it to find Sergeant Major Pruitt standing there, 2 cups of coffee in hand, looking like a man who'd decided he needed answers more than he needed sleep. Figured you might want this, he said, holding one out. She took it, studied him for a moment before stepping back to let him in. You're persistent, Sergeant Major. 26 years teaches you when something's worth being persistent about. They sat across from each other at the small table, steam curling up between them. You could have told me who you were, Pruitt said. Out by the fence. I could have. Why didn't you? Fallon turned her cup slowly in her hands. Because the second I identify myself, people start performing. They stop being who they actually are and start being who they think I want to see. I needed Fort Renner to keep being exactly what it already was, even if that meant getting hit. Especially then. Pruitt shook his head slowly, something between admiration and disbelief. That's cold. That's the job. How long have you been on post? 6 days. Long enough to know this base has a rot problem a lot bigger than one captain with a temper. Pruitt's jaw tightened. Ashcombe. It wasn't a question. Fallon didn't answer it like one either. I've read 6 complaints filed against Bregman in the last 18 months, she said. Witnesses. Documentation. Everyone dismissed by the same signature. Pruitt set his coffee down, slow, careful, like his hands needed something to do besides shake. I filed one of those complaints, he said quietly. 2 years ago. Different officer. Same pattern. Nothing happened. I know. You read my file too. I read everyone's file. He looked at her a long moment. Something shifting behind his eyes, not suspicion anymore. Something closer to recognition. Like he was finally looking at the actual shape of the storm he'd sensed out by the fence that morning. What happens now? Fallon set her coffee down, folded her hands on the table, steady, deliberate, the way she'd been trained to hold herself in rooms far more dangerous than this one. Now, she said, we find out exactly how deep this goes. Outside, the wind picked up across the flat scrub of Fort Renner, carrying dust against the windows in a low, steady hiss. Somewhere across the base, in a locked evidence room, nobody outside a very small circle had access to yet, a folder sat waiting to be opened. 6 complaints. 1 signature. A pattern that stretched back further than 18 months, further than anyone at Fort Renner currently understood. Fallon didn't know it yet, not the full shape of it, not the names still buried 3, 4, 5 layers deeper than Grant Ashcombe's office. But she understood enough. Enough to know that the slap in the mess hall hadn't been the beginning of anything. It had only been the first thread, and she intended to pull every single one of them until the whole structure came down. Because somewhere in this base's records, in numbers nobody had bothered cross-referencing until tonight, was proof that Ashcombe hadn't simply failed to stop Bregman. He had protected him, deliberately, repeatedly. Signature after signature, complaint after complaint, quietly disappeared into administrative silence, while soldiers like Nolan bled into gravel, and soldiers like Farrow got shipped off to Louisiana for the crime of speaking up. Fallon looked at Pruitt across the small table, coffee going cold between them, and something in her chest settled into place. Not satisfaction. Not yet. Just clarity. The particular quiet certainty of a woman who had learned a long time ago that patience wasn't the absence of anger. It was anger, disciplined into something that could actually win. Get some sleep, Sergeant Major, she said. Tomorrow, this base finds out how much it's been getting away with. He nodded once, stood, and left her alone with the wind outside and the folder she hadn't opened yet, the one with Ashcombe's signature on every page, waiting for morning, waiting for the moment the whole rotten foundation of Fort Renner would finally begin to crack. Morning came to Fort Renner, the color of a bruise. Gray-purple sky, low clouds dragging their bellies across the flat horizon, the kind of light that made everything look like a photograph nobody wanted to keep. Fallon Bracewell hadn't slept. Not really. Somewhere around 3, she'd stopped pretending and started reading instead. Ashcombe's file spread across the small desk in her quarters. 6 complaints laid out like evidence at a crime scene, because that's exactly what they were. Because that was the thing about patterns. Once you saw one, you couldn't unsee it. Complaint 1, dismissed. Complaint 2, dismissed. Complaint 3, complaint 4, complaint 5, dismissed, dismissed, dismissed. each one signed by the same steady hand, each one buried under language so bureaucratically bland it almost sounded reasonable. Personality conflict. Leadership style difference. Insufficient corroboration. Except corroboration was right there. Witnesses. Names. Statements that lined up too cleanly to be coincidence. Which meant Ashcombe hadn't just failed to notice. He'd chosen not to. A knock at her door, sharp. 2 raps, pause. 1 more. Pruitt's knock. She'd learned it in 6 days the way you learn a person's footsteps before you learn their face. It's open. He stepped in holding 2 coffees and a look on his face like a man who hadn't slept either. You look like hell, he said. So do you. Fair. He set 1 cup down in front of her. We pulled Bregman's cell records overnight. Nothing incriminating there. But here's the thing. Somebody's been calling Ashcombe's personal line. Numbers not registered to anyone on post. Fallon looked up. Burner? Looks that way. How many calls? 4. All in the last 2 weeks. She sat back. The coffee forgotten. Her mind already moving 3 steps ahead, the way it always did. Once a thread started pulling loose. Because burner phones didn't call colonels about boot polish infractions. Burner phones called colonels when something needed to stay off the record entirely. I want that number traced, she said. Already requested it. Should have something by this afternoon. Her phone buzzed against the desk. She glanced down. Unknown number, she answered. Said nothing. Waited. A voice on the other end, digitally flattened, stripped of anything that might identify it. You should have stayed in your lane, Major. The line went dead before she could respond. Pruitt watched her face. What? Someone knows my rank. She set the phone down slow, deliberate, the way she set down everything when her pulse wanted to do something her hands weren't going to allow. Someone who isn't supposed to know it yet. Because the investigation was still technically sealed. Which meant whoever had just called her had access they shouldn't have. Which meant this wasn't just about Bregman anymore, and it hadn't been for a while. She texted the message to Pruitt's team along with a note. Trace it. Don't expect much. Then deleted the exchange and finished her coffee like her hands weren't faintly unsteady, because they weren't allowed to be. By noon, the investigators had commandeered an entire wing of the administration building. Whiteboards climbing the walls floor to ceiling, string connecting names to dates to dollar amounts. The visual architecture of a conspiracy nobody at Fort Renner had wanted to admit was standing in plain sight the whole time. Fallon walked the room slow, hands behind her back, reading everything twice. Ashcombe's dismissals, Bregman's pattern of escalating misconduct, and underneath it all, a name that kept surfacing in the margins of documents that had no obvious reasons to mention it. A supply contract here, a personnel transfer there. Small inconsistencies that on their own meant nothing, and together meant everything. Lieutenant General Foster Danbridge. She stopped in front of the board where his name appeared for the 4th time. Who flagged this? She asked. A young analyst near the back raised a hand. I did, ma'am. Danbridge signed off on 3 transfer requests over the past 2 years. All 3 soldiers had filed complaints shortly before their transfer orders came through. All 3 ended up at posts nowhere near their families, nowhere near legal counsel who might have helped them follow up. Coincidence? I don't believe in those anymore. Fallon almost smiled. Almost. Neither do I. Because that was the shape of it now, wasn't it? Not one bad captain. Not even one complicit colonel. A structure. Layered. Deliberate. Built by people who understood exactly how to make consequences disappear before they ever reached the people responsible. Her phone buzzed again. This time a text, not a call. We know where you sleep. She stared at it for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough to feel the cold drop through her stomach, not long enough to let it show on her face, because Pruitt was standing 4 feet away, and the last thing this investigation needed was its lead officer looking rattled in front of the team she was supposed to be steadying. She turned the phone face down on the table, because panic was a luxury, and she didn't have the room for it. Not yet. She'd requested backup 2 days earlier, and by that afternoon it arrived in the form of Lieutenant Nora Wilkes, sharp-eyed 26. The kind of officer who took notes faster than most people could think, and asked exactly one question at a time, never two, because two questions let people wriggle out of answering either one cleanly. Ma'am. Wilkes set a folder on the table between them. Preliminary trace on the burner. It ran through 3 relay towers before it died, but the activation point puts it somewhere in the DC metro area. Fallon's eyebrows lifted slightly. Not local, not even close, which meant whoever was threatening her wasn't standing on Fort Renner soil at all, which meant this had already climbed higher than a base commander with a guilty conscience, which meant, except she stopped that thought before it finished forming, because finishing it meant accepting something she wasn't ready to accept yet, not without more. Keep pulling, she said. And Wilkes, good work. Wilkes almost smiled. Thank you, ma'am. That evening, her father called again. She almost let it go to voicemail, almost. Her thumb hovered over the red circle for 2 full rings before something stubbornness, maybe, or the exhaustion of holding every wall up at once made her answer instead. Dad, you didn't call. I said I'd call when it's done. It's not done. A pause, long enough that she could picture him exactly, standing in that garage in Amarillo, one hand braced against the workbench, like the wood itself might steady something in him that words couldn't reach. I'm coming out there, he said. Her chest tightened. Dad, you can't. This is an active federal investigation. I can't have. I'm not asking permission, Fallon. Dad, I raised you to finish what you start. I also raised you to not do it alone when you don't have to. His voice cracked at the edges. The same place it always cracked. The place he never let anyone hear except her. I've got 2 days of leave banked at the VA clinic. I'll be there Thursday. This isn't a garage project. No, he said. It's worse. Which is exactly why I'm coming. She didn't have an answer for that. Not one that wouldn't split something open between them that had been closing. Slowly, painfully, for 6 years. Okay, she said finally. Quiet. Thursday. She hung up and sat there a long moment in the dim light of her quarters, something loosening in her chest that she hadn't realized had been clenched tight since the day she left his garage for the last time. As a sniper instead of an intelligence officer, because maybe this was how it started. Not with an apology. Not with some big speech neither of them was built to give. Just a man showing up because his daughter needed him to, even if neither of them knew how to say so out loud. The break-in happened 2 nights later. She came back from the command building a little after 10, exhausted in the particular way that came from reading the same 6 complaints so many times the words had started to blur, and she knew before she even reached the door that something was wrong. The lock was intact. No forced entry. That was the first wrong thing. The second wrong thing was smaller, barely noticeable. The coffee mug on her counter had moved. An inch, maybe 2. Not enough for most people to catch. Except Fallon Bracewell wasn't most people. 6 years of sniper training taught you to notice angles, distances, the smallest deviation from what your eye expected to see. And her eye had expected that mug exactly where she'd left it that morning. Someone had been inside. Someone with the skill to leave no trace except one they wanted her to find. A message. We can get to you whenever we want. She cleared the small quarters room by room, weapon drawn, breath even, pulse steady through sheer force of will. Nothing missing, nothing broken. Just small things out of place, a warning dressed up as nothing at all. She called Pruitt. Someone was in my quarters. Jesus, are you? I'm fine. I need a security sweep and I need the camera footage from this building pulled first thing tomorrow. Maybe you should stay somewhere else tonight. I'm not running from this. Respectfully, ma'am, that's stubborn as hell. Noted. She almost smiled despite everything. Get me the footage, Sergeant Major. She hung up, checked every lock twice. Sat on the edge of the bed with her side arm on the nightstand and didn't sleep. Not really. Not in any way that counted. Because every small sound in that building had suddenly become a question she couldn't afford not to answer. The camera footage the next morning showed a man in maintenance coveralls entering through a service door at 2,114 hours. Cap pulled low, face angled carefully away from every lens in the hallway. He picked the lock in under 30 seconds, stayed inside for 11 minutes, left the same way he'd come. Facial recognition returned nothing. No hits in any database, which meant professional, which meant whoever had hired him understood exactly how to stay invisible in a system built to catch everyone else. "This is escalating," Wilkes said, standing beside the monitor, arms crossed like she was holding herself together by force. "Ma'am, we should bring in additional protective detail." "Not yet. With respect, someone broke into your home, and if we escalate now, they'll know they rattled me. They'll go quiet. Cover their tracks. We lose whatever momentum we've got." Fallon closed the laptop. Slow, deliberate. "We keep working. We keep pushing. We find out who's actually behind this before they get the chance to disappear." Wilkes didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway, because that was the thing about working for Fallon Bracewell. You didn't always agree, but you trusted the math even when you hated the variables. Thursday came. Her father's rental car pulled onto post a little before noon, and Fallon stood at the gate, checkpoint, watching him climb out, a little grayer than she remembered, a little slower in the knees. But unmistakably her father, unmistakably the man who'd taught her to hold a rifle steady before he'd ever taught her to hold a conversation about her feelings. Dad. He looked at her jaw, still faintly bruised, and something in his face went hard and soft at the same time. "He hit you." "I'm fine, that's not what I asked." She almost laughed. Almost. "It's healing." Earl Bracewell studied his daughter for a long moment, the particular scrutiny of a man who'd spent 30 years learning to read soldiers' faces for the things they wouldn't say out loud. "You look tired," he said finally. "I am tired." "Good. Means you're taking this seriously." He shouldered his bag. "So, where do we start?" "Dad, I can't have you inside the investigation. Federal." "I'm not asking to see your files, Fallon. I'm asking where the coffee is." Something in her chest cracked open, just slightly, in a way that didn't hurt the way she'd expected it to. "This way," she said. They walked toward the administration building together, and for the first time, in longer than she wanted to admit, the silence between them didn't feel like distance. It felt like something closer to peace. Travis Kellerman was 26 years old, a supply sergeant with an easy laugh and a habit of doodling in the margins of his paperwork. And he'd been carrying a secret for the better part of 8 months that was slowly eating him alive from the inside. He'd come forward on a Tuesday, quiet, nervous, sliding into the chair across from Fallon like the chair itself might report back to someone. "I've got documentation," he said. "Financial discrepancies. Contracts that got approved without the paperwork that's supposed to justify them. I started noticing it about a year ago, and I've been keeping copies ever since. Just in case." "In case of what?" "In case somebody ever asked." Fallon studied him, 26 years old, and already carrying the particular exhaustion of a person who'd been quietly afraid for far too long. Why now? Because of what happened in the mess hall. He met her eyes, steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Everybody's saying you're the real deal, that you're actually going to do something about this place. I figured maybe it was finally safe enough to say something." "It's not entirely safe," Fallon said, because she owed him the truth more than she owed him comfort. "I won't lie to you about that, but I will protect you as much as I possibly can." Kellerman nodded slow. "I'll testify. Whatever you need." "Thank you, Sergeant." He left her office that afternoon, and Fallon watched him go with something heavy settling in her chest, because she'd made promises like that before, in other rooms, to other soldiers, and she knew exactly how much weight those words carried and exactly how much they sometimes failed to hold. 3 days later, Travis Kellerman was dead. The call came in at 640 hours. Fallon was already awake, already dressed, already 3 cups of coffee into a morning that had felt wrong since the moment her eyes opened, though she couldn't have said why until Wilkes appeared in her doorway with a face gone the color of ash. "Ma'am." "It's Kellerman." Fallon's stomach dropped through the floor. "What happened?" "They're calling it a suicide." The words landed like a physical blow, and for one long moment, Fallon simply stood there, coffee cup halfway to her mouth, feeling something cold and furious rise up through her chest. "Take me there." The barracks room was small, Spartan, the kind of space that never quite felt lived in, even after months of occupation. Yellow tape sealed the door. 2 military police stood guard outside, straightening when they saw her approach. Inside, blood had dried dark against the wall behind the bed. A single spent casing lay on the floor. Kellerman's service weapon rested on the nightstand, exactly where a staged scene would place it. Fallon walked the room slow, methodical, the way she'd been trained to walk a scene a decade earlier in a different uniform for a different kind of mission entirely. "Talk to me," she said to the investigator standing near the door. Preliminary red is self-inflicted, gunshot residue on his right hand. No signs of forced entry. Door was locked from inside. Fallon knelt beside the bed, studied the blood spatter, the angle of it, the way it climbed the wall in a pattern that didn't quite match what a seated, self-inflicted wound would produce. Because 6 years of sniper training had taught her to read trajectories the way other people read handwriting. Angle of impact, distance, elevation. The invisible math that told the true story behind every wound, whether the person who left it wanted that story told or not. "This spatter's wrong," she said quietly. The investigator frowned. "Ma'am?" If he was sitting on the edge of the bed when the shot was fired, the pattern would be lower, more concentrated. "This," she gestured at the wall, the climbing arc of dark red. "This reads like he was standing, maybe even on his knees. You're saying someone forced him down. I'm saying somebody staged this to look like something it wasn't." She stood, slow, her jaw tight. "Pull the security footage. Every camera on this building. I want a full timeline of the last 24 hours. The footage came back 3 hours later, and it took Fallon exactly 4 minutes of watching to find what she already knew would be there. A 5-minute gap. 2130 to 2135. The exact window when, according to the coroner's early estimate, Kellerman had died. "System glitch," the technician explained, not quite meeting her eyes. "Happens sometimes." How often? Maybe once a month, and it happened to glitch during the exact 5 minutes someone needed it to. The technician didn't answer that, didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound exactly as damning as it was. Fallon stood in the hallway outside Kellerman's room, hands clenched at her sides, grief and fury tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate one from the other anymore, because she'd promised him protection. She'd looked a 26-year-old sergeant in the eye and told him she'd keep him safe. And 3 days later, he was dead on a floor that someone had carefully, deliberately arranged to look like despair instead of murder. Her father found her there 20 minutes later, didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, the way he used to stand beside her on the range when she was 14, and missing every shot and too stubborn to admit how much it was killing her. "You didn't do this," he said finally. "I told him I'd protect him. You're one person, Fallon. Not God. That's not good enough." "No," Earl Bracewell said quietly. "It isn't, but it's true anyway." She didn't answer that. Couldn't. Not without her voice breaking in a way she wasn't willing to let happen in a hallway full of federal investigators. So she stood there instead, her father's shoulder an inch from hers, and let the silence hold what words couldn't. The phone records took 2 days to fully untangle, and when they did, the picture they revealed made Fallon's blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with Texas heat. A burner number, the same one that had called Ashcomb's personal line, the same one that had likely called whoever staged Kellerman's death, traced back through 3 relay points before finally, landing on a single verified contact. Lieutenant General Foster Danbridge. He called this number 4 times in the 6 days before Kellerman died, Wilkes said, spreading the printout across the table. And the last call came in at 2,119 hours the night of the murder, 16 minutes before the security footage glitched. Fallon stared at the timeline until the numbers blurred. "That's not coincidence." "No, ma'am, it isn't." Pull everything on Danbridge. Every transfer he signed off on in the last 5 years. Every complaint that crossed his desk. "I want to know how many other Kellermans there are that we haven't found yet." By that evening, the answer came back worse than she'd feared. 2 other deaths, both ruled suicide, both involving soldiers who had recently filed complaints against senior officers. Both cases closed within a week. No follow-up investigation. No forensic review. A pattern, not an accident. A method, refined and repeated, by someone who understood exactly how to make inconvenient people disappear without ever raising an alarm. "He's done this before," Fallon said, mostly to herself, staring at the board where Danbridge's name now sat circled in red, which means he's not improvising, which means somebody taught him how, or somebody's protecting him well enough that he's never had to worry about getting caught. "Somebody above him," Pruitt said quietly. "Somebody above him." The knock at her office door came just after 8 that night. A civilian man, mid-50s, face lined with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a weight far too heavy for far too long. "Major Bracewell," he said. "My name is Daniel Kellerman. Travis was my nephew." Fallon rose immediately, something tightening in her chest. "Mr. Kellerman, I am so sorry for your loss. Save it." His voice cracked, not from anger but from grief worn down to its rawest edge. "I don't want sympathy. I want you to finish what he started." He set a small drive on her desk, hands trembling. "I worked logistics contracting for 15 years before they pushed me out for asking too many questions. I've been sitting on this for 2 years, scared to do anything with it. But Travis believed in you. Told me right before." His voice broke completely, and he had to stop, breathe, force the words back into order. "Right before he died, he told me you were the first person on this post who actually seemed like she'd follow through." Fallon picked up the drive, felt the weight of it, not physical, but the other kind, the kind that came from knowing exactly what might be waiting inside. "What's on here?" "Financial records, contracts, names." Daniel Kellerman's jaw tightened. "Proof that this isn't just some general covering for a captain. This goes higher, much higher." "How high?" He looked at her, and something in his expression told her the answer before he said it out loud. "High enough that you're not going to believe it until you see it for yourself." She plugged the drive into her laptop that night, alone, her father asleep in the small guest cot they'd set up in the corner of her quarters. Wilkes and Pruitt gone home to grab what little rest they could before morning. Spreadsheets loaded first, then scanned documents, then email chains, dense with financial language designed to obscure exactly what it was describing. She scrolled and felt something cold settle into her stomach with every new name that surfaced, every new dollar amount, every new connection drawn between contracts and cover-ups and careers quietly destroyed to keep the machine running smooth. Then she found it, a name that appeared in email after email, always at a careful distance, always through intermediaries, but unmistakable once you knew what you were looking for. Senator Warwick Thorne. Fallon sat back slowly, the laptop's glow the only light in the room, her pulse suddenly loud in her own ears, because this wasn't a rogue captain anymore, wasn't even a corrupt colonel, or a lieutenant general with a talent for making problems disappear. This was 15 years of careful, deliberate architecture, contracts steered, complaints buried, careers destroyed, and at least 3 lives ended. All of it running through a network that traced, thread by thread, back to a sitting United States senator with a seat on the very committee, meant to oversee the military he'd been quietly looting for a decade and a half. She thought of Kellerman's blood on that wall, thought of Bregman's hand connecting with her jaw, small and almost irrelevant now against the scale of what she was looking at, thought of Ashcomb's signature, dismissing complaint after complaint. Not out of laziness, but out of obedience to something much larger than himself. Her father stirred in the corner cot, half waking. "Fallon? Go back to sleep, Dad. You're not sleeping." "No," she said quietly, eyes still fixed on the screen on Thorne's name circled now in the same red ink as Danbridge's. "I don't think I will be for a while." She sat with it until dawn, until the gray light crept back through the window, the same way it had the morning after the slap, the same flat, unforgiving Texas light that didn't care what it illuminated. By the time Pruitt and Wilkes arrived for the morning briefing, Fallon had already printed everything, organized it, built the beginning of a case that no longer had a ceiling. She stood at the front of the room, the whiteboard behind her, now stretching from Bregman all the way up through Ashcombe, through Danbridge, and finally, at the very top, a name none of them had expected to see when this had started 6 days ago, with nothing more than a slap in a crowded mess hall. "This is bigger than Fort Renner," she said, her voice steady despite the storm building behind it. "Bigger than one base, one captain, one colonel covering for him. We are looking at a network that has been operating for 15 years, that has killed at least 3 people to protect itself, and that leads directly to a sitting United States senator." The room went silent. The particular, heavy silence of a group of people realizing exactly how much larger the fight in front of them had just become. "Ma'am," Wilkes said quietly, "if we go after a sitting senator, I know what it means. They'll come after all of us. Hard, I know that too." Fallon looked around the room, at Pruitt's steady, unshaken face, at Wilkes's determined one, at her father standing near the back, arms crossed, watching his daughter with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last week from worry into something that looked unmistakably like pride. "Travis Kellerman is dead because he tried to tell the truth," she said. "We are not going to let that be for nothing." Nobody in the room moved. Nobody argued. "We build this case," Fallon continued, "so airtight that no amount of power, no amount of political weight, can make it disappear the way they've made everything else disappear for the last of 15 years. We verify every document. We corroborate every witness. And when we're finished, we're going to make sure this reaches all the way to the top and stays there." She looked at the board one last time. At Bregman's name, small now against everything above it. At Ashcomb's. At Danbridge's. At Thorne's circled in red at the very summit of a structure built on other people's silence. "This isn't about one slap in a mess hall anymore," she said quietly. "It never really was." Outside, the wind picked up across the flat Texas scrub, carrying dust against the windows the way it had every morning since she'd arrived at Fort Renner, indifferent to everything happening inside. But something in the air had shifted, something Fallon could feel the way she used to feel a shot align before she ever pulled the trigger. They were close now, closer than whoever was pulling these strings had ever expected anyone to get. And for the first time since Travis Kellerman's blood had dried dark against that barracks wall, Fallon Bracewell allowed herself to believe, just slightly, that this fight might actually be winnable. The Pentagon at midnight looked like nothing so much as a machine that had forgotten how to sleep. Lights burning in 1,000 windows, cars still pulling through the outer checkpoints, and somewhere on the 3rd floor of the Inspector General's wing, Fallon Bracewell sat across a table from a man whose signature could either save everything she'd built or bury it alongside Travis Kellerman. Secretary Marion Holcomb was 63, gray at the temples in a way that suggested he'd earned every strand of it honestly. A former 3-star himself, before the politics had claimed him the way politics eventually claimed everyone who survived long enough in this building. He held the flash drive between 2 fingers like it might detonate. "Walk me through this again," he said. Slowly. "Senator Warwick Thorne has been running a corruption network through the armed services structure for approximately 15 years. Fallon kept her voice level. Steady, the way she'd learned to keep it steady on a rooftop with a rifle, and 400 yards of wind to account for. Financial fraud, buried misconduct complaints, and at least 3 deaths made to look like suicide. 3 that we've confirmed. There may be more." Holcomb set the drive down, rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand like a man trying to physically push back the hour, the weight, the impossibility of what she'd just handed him. "Do you understand what you're asking me to authorize?" "Yes, sir." "A sitting United States Senator?" "Yes, sir. If this doesn't hold, it will hold, because it had to. Because Travis Kellerman was in the ground now instead of at his sister's wedding next spring, which he'd mentioned twice in the 11 minutes she'd known him, once with a laugh and once with the particular softness of a man who loved his family more than he'd ever admit out loud. Holcomb studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that measured not just her words but the ground beneath them. "You have 48 hours, he said finally. "I want every document verified, every witness statement corroborated. If we move on Thorne and the case doesn't hold, it won't just end your career, Major. It'll end mine. and it'll bury this investigation so deep nobody finds it again for another 15 years. Understood. Be careful. If he's half as dangerous as this drive suggests, he won't go down quietly. Fallon stood. Neither will I. She left the secretary's office a little after. 1 in the morning, the Pentagon's endless hallways stretching ahead of her in fluorescent sameness. And somewhere in the walk back to the temporary offices they'd set up for the investigation, her phone buzzed against her hip. Wilkes, ma'am, you need to see this. Now. 48 hours. The number sat in Fallon's chest like a held breath the entire drive back because 48 hours was nothing. 48 hours was barely enough time to sleep, let alone build a case strong enough to survive contact with a man who'd spent 15 years learning exactly how to make problems disappear. Except disappearing was what Thorne did to other people. Not what happened to him. Not yet. The conference room was already full when she arrived. 15 investigators. 3 attorneys from the Judge Advocate General's office. 2 forensic accountants who looked like they hadn't slept in a week and weren't going to start tonight either. Wilkes met her at the door, tablet already in hand. Master Sergeant Cole Vantry, Wilkes said. Former military police, currently assigned to Fort Renner's provost office. We pulled gas station security footage from 3 miles off post, time-stamped the night Kellerman died. Vantry filling up a truck at 2,145 hours. He makes a phone call that lasts 47 seconds. Immediately after, he drives toward the barracks. Fallon leaned over the screen. Grainy footage, a man in civilian clothes, cap low, face angled just enough away from the camera to make identification difficult. But not impossible. Not for someone who knew exactly what to look for. Cross-reference his financials, she said. Already did. Wilkes pulled up a second screen. 3 deposits, $50,000 total, routed through an offshore account that traced back, after 4 separate shell layers, to a private trust connected to Warwick Thorne's campaign infrastructure. That's motive, Fallon said quietly. That's payment. That's not enough to convict a senator. No, but it's enough to convict Vantry. And Vantry is going to give us Danbridge on a silver platter. Because men like that don't do 15 years in a federal facility to protect somebody who never once said his name out loud in a way that could be traced. By 4 in the morning, they had a federal judge on a secure line, one who specialized in military corruption cases and had built a reputation over 20 years for not particularly caring whose career burned in the process of doing his job correctly. The warrant came through at 445. By 600, federal agents from the Special Investigations Office were standing outside Master Sergeant Cole Vantry's barracks room, credentials raised, weapons holstered but present. He didn't resist, didn't say a word, just held out his wrists like a man who'd been expecting this exact moment for longer than he wanted to admit. Fallon watched the arrest over a live feed from the temporary command center, her father asleep on a cot in the corner of her office, because he'd refused flatly to leave the base until this was finished, and she hadn't had the energy or the will to argue with him about it. He'll lawyer up, Wilkes said, standing beside her. Won't say a word without a deal on the table. He doesn't need to talk yet. We have the phone records, the financials, the witness who saw him near the barracks that night. Fallon didn't look away from the screen. He's not the target, he's the door. And Danbridge is the hallway. And Thorne is the room at the end of it. Vantry's lawyer called by noon with an offer. Immunity in exchange for full cooperation, every recording, every message, every instruction he'd received and carried out over the past 2 years working, quietly, as somebody else's hands. Fallon sat across the table from the jaggy attorneys that afternoon, turning the offer over in her mind like a stone she couldn't quite decide whether to keep or throw. He killed a 26-year-old sergeant, she said. He did, the lead attorney agreed. And without his testimony, Danbridge walks, and Thorne never sees the inside of a courtroom. Immunity gets us the men who gave the order instead of just the man who pulled the trigger. Fallon closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to see Travis Kellerman's face again, the way he'd looked sitting across from her, 26 and terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Make the deal, she said, but conditional. Everything, or the deal disappears. He holds back one detail, and I will personally make sure he serves every day the law allows. By evening, Ventry sat in an interrogation room at Fort Renner, a federal prosecutor across the table, his own attorney beside him, and a recorder capturing every word. "Walk us through it," the prosecutor said. From the beginning. Ventry's jaw worked once before the words came. "I got a call from Lieutenant General Danbridge 6 days before Kellerman died. Said there was a problem that needed handling quietly. A witness who was about to embarrass people who couldn't afford to be embarrassed. Did he use the word kill? No. He said make it disappear. Make sure he can't testify." Ventry's hands, cuffed loosely in front of him, trembled slightly against the table's edge. "The meaning was clear enough, and you agreed. He wired $50,000 into my account 2 days later." The room in the command center went silent. Everyone watching the live feed with the particular stillness of people hearing a confession land exactly where they'd known it would. "Walk us through the night itself." "I used my provost credentials to access the barracks. Disabled the camera for 5 minutes. Told Kellerman I needed to talk to him about his statement. He let me in." Ventry's voice had gone flat now, mechanical, the sound of a man reciting something he'd rather forget than remember. "I shot him with his own weapon. Staged it. Wiped the gun. Placed it in his right hand. He was left-handed. I didn't know that. For the first time." Something flickered across Ventry's face that might have been guilt, or might simply have been the recognition of his own carelessness. "I just followed the instructions Danbridge gave me." Instructions this detailed. Had he given them before? Ventry hesitated, long enough that the prosecutor leaned forward. "Answer the question." 2 other times, over the past 8 years. He didn't give me names, just said he'd handled problems this way before, and that I needed to follow the same process exactly. 2 other deaths. Confirmed now, in a recorded federal interrogation, by the man who'd carried them out with his own hands. Fallon stood in the command center, arms crossed, watching the screen, and felt something cold and absolute settle into place behind her ribs. Because this was no longer a theory, no longer a pattern inferred from spreadsheets and phone records. This was a confession, documented, sealed, undeniable. "We have enough to arrest Danbridge," she said quietly. By nightfall, they did exactly that. Lieutenant General Foster Danbridge was arrested at his home in Alexandria, Virginia, federal agents at his door with a warrant that named him directly in a conspiracy involving murder for hire, obstruction, and coordinated corruption spanning nearly a decade. He didn't resist, didn't say much of anything, in fact, beyond a single clipped sentence to the agent who read him his rights. "You have no idea what you're actually stepping into." Fallon watched the footage later that night, alone in her office, her father having finally, reluctantly, gone to sleep in the small guest room they'd arranged for him nearby. She replayed Danbridge's sentence 3 times. Because it wasn't a threat, not exactly. It was something closer to a warning, delivered by a man who understood, even in the moment of his own arrest, that the structure above him remained fully intact, which meant Thorne wasn't finished, which meant the next 48 hours were going to be the hardest of this entire investigation, and Fallon Bracewell had exactly no intention of losing them. She was wrong about one thing, though. It wasn't 48 hours. It was 6. The knock at her office door came at 530, sharp 3 raps that didn't sound like Pruitt's knock, and didn't sound like Wilkes's either. Fallon opened it to find 2 military police officers standing there, expressions carefully neutral in the way expressions only go when the person wearing them has been ordered not to show anything at all. "Major Bracewell, we need you to come with us." "Is this about Danbridge?" "It's about you, ma'am." She followed them through the pre-dawn quiet of the administration building, her mind already running through every possible explanation and discarding each one before it finished forming, until they reached Secretary Holcomb's temporary office, and she saw exactly what was waiting for her inside. Holcomb, flanked by 2 attorneys she didn't recognize. A woman in a dark suit who had the particular stillness of someone from the Justice Department, and on the screen behind them, paused mid-broadcast, A press conference that had apparently happened sometime in the last 2 hours while Fallon was sleeping 4 hours she couldn't afford. "Sir, what's—" "Senator Thorne held a press conference at 4 this morning," Holcomb said, and his voice carried none of the warmth it had held 2 nights earlier. "He's filed formal complaints, alleging that you conducted an illegal investigation, violated his constitutional rights, and fabricated evidence to advance what he's calling a personal vendetta." Fallon's stomach dropped. "That's absurd. He has 3 senators backing him publicly. He has media relationships that go back 20 years. And he has just enough procedural ambiguity in how this investigation started to make his complaint stick long enough to do real damage." Holcomb's jaw tightened. "You are being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. You will surrender your credentials and your access to this investigation." The room seemed to tilt slightly, the way it had when she'd watched Bregman's face go pale in that same building weeks earlier. Except now it was her own hands unbuckling her sidearm, her own fingers setting her credentials on the desk, everything that had proven, for the last 3 weeks, exactly who she was and what she was authorized to do. "Sir, everything we've done has been by the book. We had warrants. We had a federal judge signing off on every single step. I know. Then you know this is exactly what he wants. To make me disappear before the case reaches trial. I know that too, Major." Holcomb's voice softened, just slightly, the first crack in the wall he'd been holding up since she walked in. "But my hands are tied until the Justice Department reviews his complaints. This isn't permanent, but it is for now real." Fallon set her badge down, looked at it for one long second, the small piece of metal that had let her walk into rooms nobody else could enter, that had let her promise protection to a 26-year-old sergeant who'd trusted her with his life and lost it anyway. "The evidence is documented," she said quietly. "You can remove me from this building. You cannot remove the truth." "That remains to be seen," Holcomb said, and something in his voice suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words, which was, somehow, worse than if he had. She walked out past agents who wouldn't meet her eyes, past colleagues who suddenly found reasons to look busy. Outside, the morning sun hung low and unforgiving over the Pentagon's parking structure, and Fallon stood on the steps for a long moment feeling something she hadn't felt since the day she left her father's garage for the sniper platoon all those years ago. Not fear exactly, something colder, the particular vertigo of watching the ground shift under something you'd built with your own hands. Her phone buzzed. She almost didn't look. Then she did. Unknown number. She answered anyway because some instinct told her exactly who this was going to be. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," the voice said. Not digitally altered this time, clear, cold, familiar in a way that made her stomach turn because she recognized it now, from a phone call weeks earlier, from a man currently confined to quarters pending his own court-martial. "Grant Ashcombe. How are you making calls, Colonel? You're supposed to be confined. I have friends who understand the value of flexibility." A pause, thick with something that might have been satisfaction. "Did you really think Warwick Thorne built 15 years of protection with just Danbridge and me? You've barely scratched the surface, Major, and now you've been stripped of the authority to keep digging. You'll be facing your own charges soon enough. Maybe." His voice carried none of the panic she'd expected. "But I won't be facing them alone. There are people above all of us, Major. People who've been protected so long they've forgotten what accountability even feels like. And you just handed them exactly what they needed. Proof that you're unstable, vindictive, easy to discredit." The line went dead before she could respond. Fallon stood on the Pentagon steps a long moment, phone still in her hand, the weight of Ashcomb's words settling into her chest alongside everything else. Because he was right about one piece of it, whether he meant to comfort her or gut her by saying so. This went deeper than Thorne alone. It had to. 15 years of protection wasn't built by 2 men. It was built by a structure, and structures didn't collapse just because you removed a single load-bearing wall. She called Wilkes. "Get me everything on Ashcomb's outside contacts. Every call, every visitor, every piece of mail since his confinement started. I want to know exactly how he's still operating. Ma'am, you've been stripped of authorization. I can't officially. I'm not asking officially. Fallon's voice hardened. I'm asking as the person who promised Travis Kellerman's uncle we'd finish what his nephew started. A pause on the line. Then quiet, resolute. I'll have something by tonight. She hung up and stood there another moment, watching traffic crawl along the highway beyond the Pentagon's outer ring. Ordinary people living ordinary mornings, while somewhere inside that enormous building, a network 15 years in the making, tried to decide whether it could survive one more news cycle. Her father found her 20 minutes later, having driven over the second she'd called him, his rental car pulling up along the curb with the particular urgency of a man who'd spent 30 years learning to move fast when it mattered. They took your credentials, he said. Not a question. Yeah. Fallon, I'm fine, Dad. You keep saying that. It keeps not being true. He studied her face. The same scrutiny he'd given her the day she arrived at the sniper qualification course at 18 years old. Terrified and pretending not to be. What do you need? She looked at him for a long moment. Her father. The man who'd spent 6 years believing she'd walked away from real service into something safer, something smaller, and who now stood on the steps of the Pentagon, offering to help her burn down a network that had already killed 3 people to protect itself. I need somewhere to make a phone call nobody's tracking, she said. He didn't ask why. Just nodded once and led her to his rental car. Lauren Kessler had been an investigative reporter for 11 years, most of them spent chasing stories that powerful people spent equal effort trying to bury. She met Fallon at a diner 3 miles off the Pentagon's grounds, sliding into the booth with a notepad that had clearly seen better decades and a recorder she set on the table without asking permission. You're taking a serious risk, Kessler said, talking to press while under review. They already stripped my credentials. I don't have much left to lose. That's not entirely true, and you know it. Kessler studied her. So why me? Because you don't need Pentagon access to do your job, which means they can't threaten you with the thing that usually keeps reporters quiet. Fallon slid a drive across the table. Everything's on here. Financial records, Van Tree's confession, the connection to Danbridge and through him to Senator Thorne. Verify every document yourself before you publish a word of it. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to do your job. Kessler picked up the drive, turned it slowly between 2 fingers. How do I know this holds up? Because a 26-year-old sergeant named Travis Kellerman died proving it does. I intend to make sure that means something. For the next 3 hours, Fallon walked her through everything, start to finish. The slap in the mess hall that had begun it, the pattern of dismissed complaints, the murder staged to look like grief a soldier couldn't survive, the financial trail winding all the way up to a sitting senator's private trust. Kessler took notes without looking up, her expression shifting slowly from professional skepticism into something closer to grim recognition. If even half of this holds, she said finally, this is the biggest story of my career, maybe the decade. Give me 72 hours, Fallon said. Verify what you can. Then publish. Kessler stood, tucking the drive into her jacket. Stay reachable. I'll have follow-up questions. She left without paying for her coffee. Fallon sat alone in the booth a long moment, watching the traffic outside the window, and felt the particular vertigo of having just crossed a line most officers never even approached, leaking to the press. Circumventing the chain of command entirely. If this went wrong, it would end not just her career, but potentially her freedom. But if it went right, she thought of Kellerman's blood dried dark against a barracks wall, thought of his uncle's trembling hands setting a flash drive on her desk, thought of the particular patient cruelty of a system that had spent 15 years teaching people exactly what happened to anyone who tried to tell the truth. If it went right, it would be worth every risk twice over. The next 72 hours crawled past like broken glass underfoot. Fallon stayed at her father's rented room near Post, monitoring news cycles, watching Thorne's team spin a narrative in which she was unstable, vindictive, a glory-hungry officer who'd fabricated a conspiracy to cover her own misconduct. Some of it stuck. Cable panels debated whether the investigation had gone rogue. Former officers gave carefully worded interviews, suggesting the Inspector General's office had overstepped its authority. But cracks were forming too. A few journalists started asking why federal judges had authorized warrants if there'd been no underlying evidence. Why case files were being quietly deleted from shared servers. Why a master sergeant was sitting in federal custody if the entire investigation was baseless. Thorne's team had answers for all of it. Judicial overreach, administrative housekeeping, Vantry facing unrelated charges. The answers sounded thin, rehearsed. The particular hollowness of explanations built to survive a single news cycle and nothing longer. On the morning of the third day, Fallon's phone rang at Nix. "We're publishing in 2 hours, Kessler said. "Full front page. I wanted you to have warning, because once this breaks, you're going to be standing in the middle of a storm that makes the last 3 weeks look like light rain. I've been standing in it since a mess hall in Texas. This will be worse." A pause. "I need you on record. Confirming you provided the documents. Confirming you stand behind every piece of evidence." Fallon closed her eyes for one long second. Going on record meant no walking it back. No plausible deniability if the case somehow fractured under the weight of what was about to come. "I provided the documents because the Justice Department was sitting on an investigation into corruption, reaching a sitting United States Senator," she said, each word deliberate, final. "I stand by every piece of evidence, and I believe Senator Warwick Thorne orchestrated a criminal network responsible for multiple deaths, millions in fraud, and the destruction of honest careers across this country's military. He belongs in prison." Kessler was quiet a moment. "That's the quote of the decade." "Good. Spell my name correctly." The article went live at 8 that morning. Senator linked to military corruption network, murder, fraud, and cover-ups spanning a decade, the headline read, and within 30 minutes it had detonated across every platform Fallon could think to check. By 10, 3 additional outlets had independently confirmed key details. By noon, the Senate Defense Oversight Committee announced an emergency inquiry. By early afternoon, the Justice Department held its own press conference, confirming an active federal investigation into Senator Thorne's financial dealings. Thorne held his own press conference an hour later, flanked by attorneys, his voice carrying less confidence than it had 2 days earlier. "These allegations are a coordinated smear campaign," he said, hands gripping the podium hard enough that his knuckles went pale. "Orchestrated by a disgraced officer whose own conduct is currently under federal review. I have served this country honorably for 3 decades, and I will be fully vindicated." But his voice cracked on the word vindicated, and cameras caught it. And by evening the clip was everywhere, replayed on a loop that felt, to Fallon, like something close to justice finally arriving on its own terms. Her phone rang that evening. Secretary Holcomb. "General Vance," he started, then caught himself. "Major Bracewell, I need you back at the Pentagon tomorrow morning. 800. "Am I still on leave?" A pause, long enough to carry its own answer. "That's what we need to discuss." She didn't sleep that night either. Lay awake running through every possible outcome, her father asleep in the next room, having refused once again to leave, until this reached some kind of resolution. At 7 the next morning, she put her uniform on for the first time in 3 days, checked herself in the mirror, walked into the Pentagon with her spine straight and her jaw set because whatever waited on the other side of that door, she intended to meet it standing. Holcomb's office was packed. Not just Holcomb, but the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, 2 additional generals from the Inspector General's office, and 3 people in civilian clothes, carrying themselves with a particular gravity of Justice Department attorneys who'd just spent 72 hours reviewing the biggest case of their careers. Major Bracewell. Holcomb gestured to a chair. "Sit." She sat. Spine straight, hands folded. "After reviewing the evidence published yesterday and conducting our own internal review, we have determined your actions, while unorthodox, were justified given the circumstances." Holcomb's voice carried none of the coldness from 3 days earlier. "Your administrative leave is lifted, effective immediately. You are reinstated to full authority over this investigation." Relief moved through her chest, fast and complicated, tangled up with exhaustion and grief, and something that felt almost like vindication finally arriving, 3 weeks too late for Travis Kellerman, but not, perhaps, too late for whoever came after him. "There will be a formal inquiry into how classified information reached the press," Holcomb continued. "You will be required to testify. There may be consequences, depending on findings." "Understood, sir." One of the Justice Department attorneys leaned forward. "Major, we're building a case against Senator Thorne that will require your full cooperation. We want him on charges that carry the maximum sentence available. You'll have everything I've got." The chairman of the Joint Chiefs spoke next, his voice heavy with the particular gravity of a man who'd seen institutions survive scandal before and understood exactly how much it cost them each time. "This is going to get uglier before it gets better, Major. Thorne has powerful allies. They will fight this with everything available to them." "Let them," Fallon said. "I'm not going anywhere." She stood, saluted, and walked out into a hallway that felt different than it had 3 days earlier, soldiers nodding as she passed, a few even risking a salute, despite the ambiguity of her status, small gestures that said more than any of them were willing to say out loud. Wilkes was waiting at the end of the corridor, exhausted but visibly relieved. "Welcome back, ma'am." Status on the case. Danbridge is cooperating, hoping it buys him a lighter sentence. "We recovered most of what got deleted from the shared servers." And Wilkes hesitated, something flickering across her face. Ashcomb's outside contact came back. "He's been making calls through a contraband phone smuggled in by a visitor." "We traced the visitor. Works for a private security firm with contracts tied directly to Thorne's campaign infrastructure." Fallon felt something settle into place, cold and certain. So Ashcombe was never protecting himself alone. "No, ma'am." He was still following orders, even in confinement. "Then we make sure this reaches every single person who ever gave one." The grand jury convened 8 days later. Fallon wasn't permitted inside the room, but she watched from a monitor in the prosecutor's office as witness after witness testified Vantry, describing in flat, careful detail the instructions he'd received and carried out. Financial experts walking the jury through 15 years of shell companies and fraudulent contracts. Federal agents presenting recordings Danbridge had, in a final act of self-preservation, agreed to hand over in full. The deliberation took 4 hours. The indictment came back with 19 separate counts: racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, obstruction, bribery, witness intimidation, each count carrying decades in federal prison. Senator Warwick Thorne was arrested at his home that evening. Federal agents at the door. National news cameras capturing every second of the walk to the car. His expensive suit rumpled, his face carrying an expression Fallon recognized immediately, because she'd seen it before, on Bregman's face in that Fort Renner hallway weeks earlier. The particular shock of a man discovering, for the first time in his life, that power had limits after all. She watched the footage from her office, her father beside her, both of them silent as Thorne was placed in the back of the car and driven away. "He actually believed he'd get away with it," her father said quietly. "They always do," Fallon answered. "Right up until they don't." The trial began 3 months later, in a federal courtroom in Washington that had seen its share of corruption cases, but nothing quite like this one. Media coverage was relentless, cameras camped outside from before dawn. Each morning, cable networks running live coverage of every session. Fallon testified on the 4th day, walked into the courtroom in full dress uniform, took the oath with her hands steady, on a book she respected more than she strictly believed in, and answered every question with the same measured precision she'd carried into every room since the morning Holt Bregman's hand connected with her jaw. The prosecutor led her through the timeline, start to finish. Fort Renner, the investigation into Bregman, the discovery of Ashcomb's pattern of dismissals, the trail leading to Danbridge, and finally to Thorne. "Major Bracewell," the prosecutor said, "when you first arrived at Fort Renner, did you identify yourself as a federal investigator?" "No." "Why not?" "Because if I had, Captain Bregman would have shown me the respect he denied every other soldier on that base whenever it suited him, and I would never have seen who he truly was underneath the uniform. And what did that reveal? That he represented something much larger than himself. A system that had spent years teaching men like him that consequences belong to other people. Thorne's lead attorney rose for cross-examination with the particular confidence of a man who'd spent 30 years winning cases through intimidation rather than evidence. "Major, you leaked classified investigative material to a journalist while under federal review. Isn't that correct?" "I provided documentation to a reporter because the process meant to hold your client accountable was actively being obstructed from within. That wasn't your decision to make." "It absolutely was." Fallon held his gaze without flinching. "I took an oath to defend this country's constitution, not to protect criminals, 'cause they hold elected office. You've destroyed a 30-year career based on unverified allegations." He destroyed his own career the moment he ordered a 26-year-old sergeant murdered to protect a fraud scheme 15 years in the making. "I simply made sure people found out." The exchange spread across every news outlet within hours, replayed and dissected. And by evening, public opinion already tilted hard against Thorne had shifted further still. The trial ran 8 weeks. Witness after witness, financial experts, federal agents presenting wiretap recordings, Danbridge testifying from federal custody via video, looking 20 years older than the photograph still hanging in his old office. And finally, Vauntry, describing once more, this time in open court, exactly how orders had traveled from a senator's private circle down through Danbridge, down through him, and finally into a barracks room where a 26-year-old man had trusted the wrong knock at his door. The defense tried everything available to them. Character witnesses, financial experts hired to muddy the trail, suggestions that Vauntry and Danbridge were lying to save themselves. None of it held against the weight of what the prosecution had built. The jury deliberated 6 days. When they returned, the courtroom sat packed beyond capacity: journalists, military families, soldiers who'd traveled across the country simply to witness the moment arrive. Fallon sat in the 3rd row, her father beside her, Pruitt and Wilkes 2 rows back. Daniel Kellerman near the front, hands folded so tightly, his knuckles had gone white. On the charge of racketeering, the jury foreman said, "How do you find?" "Guilty." On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder? "Guilty." 19 counts. 19 guilty verdicts, each one landing across the courtroom like something physical, something that could be felt in the chest rather than simply heard. Thorne sat motionless at the defense table, the confidence that had once carried him through 30 years of public life entirely gone now, replaced by the flat, hollow expression of a man watching his entire life end in real time. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. The judge, a woman who'd built a 20-year reputation for refusing to bend under political weight, addressed Thorne directly before delivering her ruling. "You held a position of extraordinary trust," she said. "Soldiers trusted you to advocate for their welfare. Taxpayers trusted you to steward their resources honestly. You violated every one of those trusts, repeatedly, for personal enrichment. And when your scheme was threatened, you ordered the murder of a young man who had done nothing except tell the truth." She paused, making certain he was looking at her. "I sentence you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel came down. Thorne was led out in handcuffs, walking the same path Bregman and Ashcombe and Danbridge had already walked before him, joining a system where senators and generals became, simply, inmates like any other. Outside the courthouse, Daniel Kellerman approached Fallon, his eyes wet but his voice steady. "Thank you," he said, "for not letting Marcus's death mean nothing. I'm sorry I couldn't save him. You saved everyone who comes after him. That's what he would have wanted." They shook hands. Fallon stood on the courthouse steps a long moment after he walked away, watching the crowd slowly disperse, feeling something settle in her chest that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite peace, but sat somewhere close to both. Bregman was sentenced 2 weeks after Thorne, in a separate court-martial that drew far less media attention but carried For Fallon, its own particular weight. 8 years, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of every benefit his service had ever earned him. Ashcombe received 12. Danbridge, despite his cooperation, received 20. The judge making clear that testimony didn't erase the blood already on his hands. One by one, the network that had protected Fort Renner's rot for 15 years collapsed under its own weight, exposed piece by a woman who'd let a captain slap her in a crowded mess hall because she understood, even in that first unbearable second, exactly what letting him swing would eventually reveal. 6 months after Thorne's sentencing, Fallon received notice of a promotion, major to lieutenant colonel. A formal ceremony at the Pentagon, small compared to most, but crowded with people whose lives had shifted permanently because of what had started at Fort Renner. Pruitt attended, now a command sergeant major himself. Wilkes, recently promoted to captain. Specialist Nolan, the young soldier who'd once slipped out a side door rather than watch Bregman spin his own version of events. Now a sergeant with a steadiness in his eyes that hadn't been there 3 years earlier. And her father, Earl Bracewell, stood near the back of the room in a suit he clearly hadn't worn in years, watching his daughter accept a new rank with an expression she'd never quite seen on his face before. Not worry, not the guarded concern that had defined so many of their phone calls over the years. Pride, plain and uncomplicated. Afterward, he found her near the edge of the reception, 2 cups of coffee in hand, the same gesture Pruitt had offered her that first exhausted night at Fort Renner. "I owe you an apology," he said. Fallon took the coffee, studied him. "For what?" "For 6 years of thinking you'd walked away from real service. For never once asking what the work you were actually doing might cost you." His voice caught, just slightly. In the place it always caught. "I watched you stand in that courtroom and take apart a United States senator with nothing but patience and paperwork. That's not smaller than what I did at your age. It's harder." "Dad, let me finish." He set his coffee down, reached out, and, for the first time in longer than Fallon could remember, pulled her into an embrace that held nothing back. "I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago." Fallon stood there, in the middle of a Pentagon reception hall, her father's arms around her, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the day she'd left his garage for the sniper platoon. All those years ago, believing distance was simply the cost of the work she'd chosen. It wasn't. She understood now. It had never had to be. "I love you, Dad. I love you too, kiddo." He pulled back, studying her face the way he used to study her stance on the range, checking for anything that might throw off the shot. "Now, what's next?" Fallon looked around the room, at Pruitt, laughing quietly with Wilkes near the refreshment table, at Nolan, standing a little straighter than he used to, at the framed photograph someone had hung near the entrance, Travis Kellerman's picture, placed there as part of a small memorial the Inspector General's office had commissioned in his honor. "There's a case out of Fort Dunmore," she said. "Another young officer who thinks nobody's going to believe her." Her father almost smiled. "Of course there is." "You could come with me," Fallon said, surprising herself even as the words left her mouth. "Not into the investigation. Just Amarillo's not that far from Dunmore. You could visit. I'd like that." Later that evening, standing on the steps outside the Pentagon, watching the sun drop low in gold over Washington, Fallon thought about the mess hall at Fort Renner, about Bregman's hand connecting with her jaw, and the 200 witnesses who'd frozen mid-bite, certain they'd just watched something small and ugly and forgettable. They hadn't understood, not then, that they were watching the first thread of something enormous begin to pull loose. She thought about Travis Kellerman's blood dried dark against a barracks wall, and the promise she'd made him that she hadn't been able to keep in the way that mattered most, but had kept in every other way available to her. She thought about her father's arms around her in that crowded reception hall. 6 years of distance, finally, quietly closing. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, and for one instinctive second her pulse spiked, old habits from months of threats refusing to fully release their grip. Then she read it. "Colonel Bracewell, my name is Sable Whitfield. I'm stationed at Fort Dunmore. I have information about misconduct I've been afraid to report. I heard what you did at Renner. I think maybe I'm ready to talk. Fallon read it twice, then typed back, steady, certain, the same way she'd walked out of that mess hall 3 years earlier with blood at the corner of her mouth, and nothing but calm where panic should have lived. Yes, let's talk tomorrow. You're not alone in this. She pocketed her phone, finished the last of her coffee, and looked out one final time over the Washington skyline. Lit gold and endless in the fading light, the work would never be entirely finished. She understood that now in a way she hadn't fully grasped the morning. Bregman raised his hand in that crowded mess hall. There would always be another Fort Dunmore, another Sable Whitfield, scared and uncertain, wondering if speaking up would cost her everything. But there would also, always, be someone willing to answer when they finally found the courage to ask. And that, Fallon Bracewell had learned across 3 long, brutal, unforgettable months, was enough. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to matter. Enough to be worth every threat, every sleepless night, every moment she'd stood in the wreckage of what people like Thorne had built. And refused, simply, quietly, absolutely, to look away.